The highway stretched endlessly through the white wilderness, a ghost road swallowed by the storm. Leonard Fisher gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale against the grey glow of the dashboard. The radio hissed with static as the voice of another trucker cut through, warning about the incoming front. "Snow's getting mean out there, Lenny. You might want to hole up in Laurel till morning." Leonard smiled faintly, though no one could see him. "Appreciate it, but I'm almost through. Just need to make Billings before the ice locks up the road." He had driven this route 100 times before, hauling everything from lumber to frozen produce across the northwest. But tonight, the snow came down heavier than he'd ever seen. Thick flakes whipping across his headlights, blurring the world beyond the windshield. The CB crackled again. "Suit yourself, man. Ain't no paycheck worth dying for." Leonard clicked the mic. "We all die for something, friend. Might as well be trying to make it home." A hollow laugh echoed from the speaker before the line went dead. He turned up the heater and kept his eyes fixed on the faint tire tracks ahead, the only sign another soul had braved this path. In the passenger seat sat his thermos, still half full of black coffee, and a Polaroid of his wife Diane and their boy Eddie taped to the dashboard. They were the reason he pushed on, even when common sense told him to stop. Outside, the snow clawed at the windshield like ghostly fingers. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Leonard slowed the rig to a crawl, listening to the engine strain beneath the weight of the wind. He switched the CB channel. "Breaker 19. This is Fisher out of Spokane. Anyone got eyes on the turnoff near Pryor Creek?" A pause. Then, a low, unfamiliar voice answered. "This is Red Dog. You're not going to find that turnoff tonight, friend. Storm's swallowing the whole damn county." Leonard frowned. "Red Dog, huh? You local?" A dry chuckle. "Let's just say, I know these roads better than most. You might want to park that rig before the mountain does it for you." Static filled the silence. Then nothing. Leonard exhaled, unsure why the voice unsettled him. He leaned closer to the windshield, trying to spot a sign through the curtain of snow. The road curved sharply. The rig's tires slipped, fishtailing before gripping again. His heart hammered in his chest. "Almost there," he muttered to himself. "Just a few more miles." He passed a faded sign, Billings 27 miles, and felt a surge of relief. But the storm only grew worse, the wind howling like a warning. At the edge of his headlights, something flickered, a figure, or maybe just a shadow moving across the road. Leonard hit the brakes, but when the rig stopped, there was nothing, only the endless snow. He reached for the CB again. "Red Dog, you still out there?" Silence. The storm screamed louder, and then the radio went dead. If you want to follow more real-life mysteries like this one, don't forget to subscribe before we hit the next mile marker. Leonard Fisher was never heard from again. Dawn came reluctantly over the frozen plains, grey and bitterly cold. The storm had moved east, leaving behind a landscape buried under drifts as high as truck hoods. Sheriff Tom Harkins stood beside the highway, his breath a thin mist in the air, watching as deputies worked to dig out an abandoned rig. The engine was still idling when they found it, half buried in snow near a ditch 15 miles west of Billings. The driver's door hung open. There were footprints leading a few yards away before vanishing in the whiteness. "Fisher's truck," Deputy Klein said, squinting at the registration. "Spokane plates, load still intact." Harkins nodded, jaw tight. "Any sign of him?" "Nothing yet. We'll get dogs out once the wind calms. Right now, they'd lose the scent in seconds." The sheriff stepped closer to the truck, peering inside. The cab looked untouched, coffee thermos, map folded neatly, photo taped to the dash. A man's entire world reduced to a few small things. He looked out toward the open plain, where the horizon dissolved into white. "Nobody lasts long out here on foot," he muttered. By noon, search parties fanned across the area, volunteers, ranchers, and a few off-duty officers who knew Leonard from passing him at local truck stops. They combed the fields, shouting his name into the wind. The sound was swallowed whole. Inside the small command trailer parked near the site, Harkins briefed the team. He could have wandered off looking for help. Hypothermia messes with your head, makes you think you're warm when you're freezing to death. A paramedic nodded grimly. If he's been out all night, Sheriff, we're not looking for someone alive. Harkins didn't answer. He just stared at the map, a red circle marking the last known coordinates. That night the temperature dropped below zero again. The rescuers returned one by one, their flashlights bobbing through the darkness like distant fireflies. Nothing. No body, no sign of struggle, just the empty road and the whisper of wind over snow. Back in Billings, Diane Fisher stood at the kitchen sink, phone pressed to her ear, listening as Harkins told her the news. "So you're saying you found his truck, but not him?" "That's right, ma'am. We're still searching, but conditions are rough. We'll keep at it." Her voice trembled. "Leonard knows those roads, Sheriff. He wouldn't just walk off into a blizzard." "I understand," Harkins said softly. "We're not giving up." When the call ended, Diane sat at the table and stared at Leonard's empty coffee mug. The silence of the house was unbearable. Days turned into a week. The storm returned once more, sealing the land under fresh ice. Reporters called it the Fisher disappearance, and truckers passing through the region swapped theories over diner counters. Some said he'd run off to start a new life. Others whispered about thieves or something darker. Harkins didn't believe either. He'd seen the look in Diane's eyes, the steady faith that her husband was no runaway. Still, he knew that Montana's winters could keep their secrets for a long time, and somewhere out there, buried under the endless snow, the truth was waiting. Before he became a name whispered in truck stops and police reports, Leonard Fisher was just a man trying to make a living on the open road. Born in Great Falls, Montana in 1947, he grew up with the sound of diesel engines echoing from the highway that ran behind his father's repair shop. By 16, he could strip a carburetor faster than most men twice his age. After high school, he joined the Army, serving 2 tours in Vietnam as a mechanic. The war left him quiet, the kind of man who spoke only when necessary. When he came home in 1972, he found a country that had changed, and a silence in himself he couldn't quite fill. Trucking became his answer. The long drives, the solitude, the endless lines of asphalt. It gave him space to breathe. By the time he married Diane in 1979, Leonard was already a seasoned driver. Diane was a nurse from Billings, strong-willed and sharp-tongued, with a laugh that could cut through the worst kind of day. Together they built a life that revolved around schedules, mileage logs, and the sound of the phone ringing late at night when Leonard called from a payphone 2 states away. Their son Eddie was born in 1981, a curious, bright-eyed boy who waited by the window every Friday for his father's headlights to appear down the road. Leonard would bring him small gifts from every stop: a toy car from Boise, a postcard from Cheyenne, a carved bear from Kalispell. But as the years passed, the runs grew longer, the calls shorter, and Diane's patience thinner. Money was always tight. The economy in the early 90s hit small freight operators hard. Leonard worked for a regional carrier out of Spokane, hauling whatever they could find: grain, timber, machinery parts. The pay barely covered the bills, but quitting wasn't an option. "A man's got to keep moving," he'd tell Diane. "If I stop, I'll rust." She'd sigh, sometimes smiling, sometimes not. "You're not a truck, Len. You're a husband. You're a father." He'd nod, promise to slow down, then pack up again 2 days later. Those who knew him described Leonard as calm under pressure, a man who didn't drink, didn't gamble, and never raised his voice. But there was something distant about him too, as if part of him was still on those long jungle roads overseas. On the night he vanished, he'd been driving a route he knew well. His logbook was neat, his last phone call routine. Nothing suggested he was in trouble. Yet Diane had felt uneasy that evening, a weight she couldn't explain. She remembered his final words on the phone: "I'll be home by morning, save me some pie." The next morning she woke to silence, and that silence never lifted. Leonard Fisher, the man behind the wheel, had spent his life mastering the roads of Montana. But somewhere along that final stretch outside Billings, those same roads turned against him. And what was left behind was more than a disappearance. It was the beginning of a mystery no one saw coming. By February of 1991, the case of Leonard Fisher had already begun to lose the urgency that follows most missing person reports. The storm had passed. The roads reopened, and new headlines pushed his story off the front page. But Sheriff Tom Harkins couldn't let it go. Something about that truck sitting there with the engine running and the door open didn't feel like a man who simply lost his way. Harkins met with his small team in the cramped office of the Yellowstone County Sheriff's Department. Maps of the area were spread across the table, dotted with red pins marking every location the trucker had been sighted that night. His last CB call came from near Pryor Creek, Harkins said. But there's a strange one right before that. Some guy identifying himself as Red Dog. Deputy Klein flipped through a stack of handwritten notes. We checked the CB logs. No registered handle by that name in this district. Could be a drifter, someone using a fake call sign. Harkins leaned back, rubbing his temples. Or someone who didn't want to be found. They also discovered something else. A receipt from a gas station near Hardin, time-stamped 2 hours after Leonard's final radio call. The name signed on it read L. Fisher, but the handwriting didn't match his known samples. Maybe someone used his card, Klein said. Or maybe he wasn't alone, Harkins replied quietly. That lead brought them to the Trail Stop Diner, a lonely roadside restaurant off Interstate 90, frequented by truckers and ranch hands. The owner remembered the storm that night, the lights flickering, the wind howling, and a waitress named Carolyn Briggs recalled serving coffee to a man fitting Leonard's description. He came in just before midnight, she told Harkins, twisting a napkin between her fingers. Looked worn out but polite. He wasn't alone, though. There was another man with him, maybe younger, dark hair, denim jacket. They didn't talk much, but something was off. The other guy kept looking around, jumpy. Did you hear them say anything? Harkins asked. She hesitated. I think I heard the young one call him Len. And later, when they were leaving, I swear I saw the man take Leonard's truck keys off the counter before they walked out. I thought maybe they were partners. Harkins exchanged a look with Klein. You ever see that man again? No, but I remember the truck, big red Kenworth, Spokane plates. It was still idling out front when they left into the storm. That night, Harkins drove back along Highway 87, headlights cutting through the frozen dark. The details circled in his head, an unregistered voice on the CB, a forged receipt, a mystery companion. He parked near the spot where Leonard's rig had been found, the wind moaning across the fields. The snow had long since covered the footprints, but the sheriff could feel the weight of something unfinished pressing against the silence. If Leonard Fisher had met someone out there, then that person had vanished just as completely. And for Harkins, the question was no longer where Leonard Fisher had gone, but who had gone with him. The Trail Stop Diner sat just off Interstate 90, its neon sign flickering against the frozen night. For years, truckers had used it as a waypoint, a place to warm up, swap stories, and escape the loneliness of the road. It was also where Sheriff Harkins returned a few days after his first visit, hoping something new might shake loose from memory. Waitress Carolyn Briggs met him at the counter, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. "You're still chasing that trucker?" she asked, half curious, half weary. "Still am," Harkins said. "Something tells me he didn't just walk off that night." She nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about it too. After you left, I went through my old notebook. We used to jot down plate numbers, company policy in case someone skipped a bill. I found the entry from that night, Leonard Fisher's rig and another vehicle right after, an old Ford pickup with Idaho plates. They didn't belong together." Harkins leaned forward. "You sure about that?" "As sure as I am about the coffee being bad," she said with a faint smile. "That pickup was beat to hell. The man in the denim jacket drove it. I remember because he asked me for change for the payphone. Hands were shaking. Looked like he'd been out in the cold too long, or maybe just nervous." Harkins wrote it down. "What about their interaction? Anything unusual?" She thought for a moment. "They argued quietly, like two people who didn't want to be heard. At one point, the younger man grabbed Leonard's sleeve, said something like, 'We had a deal.' Leonard pulled away. Then they both went silent. The sheriff's pencil stopped moving. 'We had a deal, huh? That's not the kind of thing you say before a friendly drive.' Carolyn lowered her voice. 'Sheriff, I don't know what happened after they left, but something bad was following that man. I could see it on his face. Harkins stood, leaving a business card on the counter. "If you remember anything else, even a detail that seems small, call me." She nodded. "You find him, Sheriff. That family deserves to know." Outside, the sky was steel grey, and the highway stretched on like a scar through the snow. Harkins climbed into his truck, the heater barely keeping up with the cold. He radioed Deputy Klein. "Run a check on any stolen pickups matching Idaho plates in the last month. Focus on ones dumped near the border." Klein came back a few minutes later. "Got one report from Coeur d'Alene. Blue Ford, plates ripped off, found abandoned near Missoula 2 days after the storm." "That's our thread," Harkins said. "Let's pull it." But days later, when they tracked down the pickup, it had been stripped clean, no fingerprints, no personal items, just the smell of oil and rust. Another dead end. Back at his office, Harkins stared at the caseboard, photos pinned under curling edges. The storm had erased the tracks, but someone out there knew what happened to Leonard Fisher. And if that someone was still alive, Harkins was determined to find him before the trail went cold for good. By spring, the Fisher case had faded from the headlines. Snow melted into slush, the roads reopened, and the world seemed ready to move on. But for Diane Fisher, time had stopped on that January night. The empty chair at the kitchen table, the jacket still hanging by the door, everything in her Billings home remained as Leonard had left it. Detectives came and went, each visit shorter than the last. They collected reports, photographs, statements. None of it mattered. There was still no body, no suspect, no real clue to hold on to. Officially, Leonard Fisher was missing, presumed dead. Unofficially, Diane refused to say the words. Her son Eddie, 10 years old now, tried to be strong. He stopped asking when his father would come home, but sometimes Diane caught him outside, sitting by the driveway, staring down the empty road. One evening, a letter arrived from the trucking company in Spokane. It wasn't condolences, it was paperwork. Leonard's truck had been repossessed, his route closed, his wages suspended. They offered sympathy, but not much else. Diane folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer with the rest. Bills, forms, unanswered correspondence from the sheriff's office, a file of things that couldn't bring him back. Neighbors offered help at first. Casseroles, kind words, promises to pray. But as months passed, so did the visits. People didn't know what to say anymore. Some whispered theories. He'd run off, maybe got in trouble, maybe found another life somewhere warm. Diane ignored them all. Leonard wasn't the kind of man who runs, she told anyone who tried to comfort her. The seasons turned again. 1992 brought another brutal winter, and with it, the same gnawing silence. Eddie started acting out, fights at school, skipped classes, late nights wandering the edge of town. Diane tried to reach him, but grief had settled between them like another wall of ice. One night she found him in the garage, sitting in his father's old trucker cap, the brim low over his eyes. "He's not coming back, is he?" he asked quietly. Diane hesitated, her throat tight. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I believe we'll find the truth." Eddie looked up. "Then why isn't anyone looking anymore?" She had no answer. That winter, Sheriff Harkins retired. The new sheriff promised to review cold cases when resources allowed, but Diane knew that meant the file would sit in a drawer gathering dust. The last person who truly cared about the case had moved on, and so had the town. Every year, on the anniversary of Leonard's disappearance, Diane drove to the spot where his rig had been found. She'd park by the ditch and stand in silence, the wind biting at her coat. Sometimes she swore she could still hear the faint hum of a diesel engine carried on the breeze. The world had kept turning, but for the Fishers it had stopped in 1991, and in that frozen silence a question lingered, one that would not stay buried forever. By 2001, 10 years had passed since Leonard Fisher vanished into the snow. Montana had changed. New truck stops, new roads, new faces. But for Eddie Fisher, the ghosts of Highway 87 never left. At 20, he'd followed the same path as his father, earning his CDL straight out of high school and climbing behind the wheel of a Kenworth of his own. Driving was the only thing that made sense, the only time his thoughts felt quiet. He didn't talk much about his father. Most people in Billings had long stopped asking. But on long night runs across Wyoming and the Dakotas, he found himself listening to the CB radio, the chatter of strangers filling the silence. Handles like Longshot, Diesel Queen, Road Ghost. They came and went, familiar voices on an endless highway. Then, one night near Miles City, a name came through the static that made Eddie's blood run cold. Breaker 19, this is Red Dog, eastbound on the 94. Anybody got eyes on the snow up ahead? Eddie froze. The voice was older, deeper, but that name, Red Dog. He reached for the mic. Red Dog, say again, you local? A pause, then a dry laugh. Been local everywhere, kid. You new to the road? Something like that, Eddie said, heart pounding. You ever run through Billings back in 91? The channel crackled. For a moment, Eddie thought the man had signed off. Then came a low reply. That's a long time ago, son. Best to let old Winters stay buried. The radio went silent. Eddie pulled into a rest area, his hands trembling. He hadn't heard that name since the police reports, the ones he'd secretly read as a teenager when his mother thought he was asleep. Red Dog, the mysterious voice from his father's last CB transmission. He spent the next week chasing that voice across frequencies, calling out on every channel he could. No answer. But then, on a foggy night outside Livingston, it came again. Same handle, same slow drawl. Eddie's breath caught. Red Dog, this is Fisher. You hear me? The voice chuckled, quieter now. Fisher, huh? That's a name I ain't heard in a long while. Who are you? Eddie demanded. What did you do to my father? A sharp burst of static drowned out the reply. Then the channel went dead. Eddie sat there, the hum of his engine the only sound left. His hands gripped the wheel until his knuckles whitened. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, he'd made a decision. He called the only man who'd ever cared about the case, former Sheriff Tom Harkins, now retired and living near Red Lodge. The phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. Harkins here. This is Eddie Fisher, he said. I think I just talked to Red Dog. There was a long silence on the line. Then Harkins sighed. Son, some roads don't need to be driven twice. Maybe not, Eddie replied, but this one's mine. The line clicked dead, and just like that, the old mystery that Montana had buried under snow was beginning to thaw. It was early September when the call came in. Construction crews working east of Billings near Lockwood had uncovered something strange while digging for a new highway expansion. At first, they thought it was animal bones. Montana soil often gave up the remnants of deer or cattle long forgotten. But when the foreman saw a piece of fabric clinging to the dirt, and what looked unmistakably like a human jaw, he stopped the machinery cold. By the time the sheriff's department arrived, the sun had already dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows over the site. Deputies cordoned off the area, floodlights flickering in the evening wind. The remains were found shallow, too shallow for a burial done in peace. A rusted watch was still on the wrist. The leather band was cracked, but the engraving on the back was clear. LF. The next morning, the county coroner confirmed it. After 10 years, they had finally found Leonard Fisher. News traveled fast through Billings. For Diane, the call came just after sunrise. She sat in silence as the words filtered through the line, her hand gripping the receiver so tightly it left marks. We found him, the deputy said. We're bringing him home. Eddie was already on the road when she reached him. He pulled over, headlights washing across a field of golden wheat, and listened without speaking. 10 years of waiting, of wondering, all collapsing into a single moment of truth. That afternoon the Fisher case file was reopened. The bones showed signs of trauma, not from the elements, but from something else. A fracture along the back of the skull, consistent with a blunt object. It wasn't an accident, it wasn't the storm. Sheriff Mason, the new head of the department, briefed the media carefully. We are treating this as a homicide investigation, he said. Mr. Fisher did not die from exposure. Someone left him there. Diane sat in the back of the press room, unseen, her face pale but steady. For her, the announcement was both a wound and a release. She had prayed for closure, but not like this. When Eddie drove up from Wyoming 2 days later, the two embraced without words. They found his watch, Diane whispered. The one I gave him our first Christmas. Eddie nodded. Then we're not done yet. Investigators recovered more from the shallow grave, a metal key half buried beside the ribcage, and Leonard's leather wallet, still holding cash, his driver's license, and a folded note that had survived the years. The ink was faded, but one word stood out clearly. Sorry, forensic teams ruled out robbery. Nothing of value was missing. Which meant whoever killed Leonard had a different reason. When the sheriff's office released the discovery to the public, truckers across the region began to talk again. Old rumors resurfaced about that storm, about a stranger using the handle Red Dog. For Diane and Eddie, it was no longer a mystery about where Leonard had gone. Now, it was about who had gone with him. And that question was about to shake everything they thought they knew. The discovery of Leonard Fisher's remains hit Montana like a cold wind from the past. Newspapers called it a miracle of thaw, the long-buried truth finally unearthed. But for investigators, it was only the beginning. DNA pulled from a fragment of cloth near the grave matched an entry in the national database, a name that hadn't surfaced in years, Robert Laramie, known to some as Red Dog. Robert Red Dog Laramie had a record stretching back decades: petty theft, assault, and several incidents tied to hijacked cargo shipments across the Midwest. He was a drifter, a man without roots or loyalty, last arrested in 1998 in South Dakota for truck theft. Since then, he'd disappeared again, until now. Sheriff Mason's team coordinated with federal marshals. Within a week, Laramie was found living in a run-down trailer outside Rapid City, his hair gray, his face worn by time. When they cuffed him, he didn't resist. "Guess you boys been waiting a while," he said quietly. At the station, Mason watched through the glass as detectives questioned him. Laramie sat with a crooked smile, hands folded neatly on the table. "You're saying I killed Fisher," he said, almost amused. "You think I buried him out there in the snow?" The detective across from him leaned forward. "Your DNA's on his jacket. You knew him." "You were the last voice he talked to before he vanished." Laramie smirked. "Yeah, I knew him, Leonard Fisher. We ran the same roads for a while. He was a decent man. Didn't deserve what happened." "So you admit being there?" "I admit I was with him," Laramie said, his tone darkening. "But I didn't kill him." Mason entered the room. "Then tell me what did happen." Laramie looked up, meeting the sheriff's eyes. "You ever been out there in a whiteout, Sheriff? You ever feel the wind so hard you can't tell the sky from the ground? That night was like that. He got scared. We both did. But what happened after, that wasn't murder." Mason folded his arms. "Then what was it?" "A mistake," Laramie whispered. He refused to elaborate. Every question about that night met the same wall: silence or half-truths. But one thing was clear: Laramie knew far more than he was willing to share. When the news reached Billings, Diane and Eddie sat in the living room, the television flickering blue against their faces. Eddie clenched his fists. "That's him," he said. "That's Red Dog. I heard his voice." Diane nodded, her eyes hollow. "Then this time we'll get answers." The next morning, Eddie drove to the county jail requesting to speak with Laramie. He was denied, but through the small window of the visiting area, he saw the man for the first time, a wiry figure with eyes that carried a strange mix of guilt and defiance. Later, Sheriff Mason briefed the press. "Robert Laramie is in custody and charged with obstruction and unlawful disposal of a body. We're still determining the full circumstances of Fisher's death." But behind closed doors, even Mason admitted what the evidence suggested. Red Dog hadn't been just a witness. He'd been there when Leonard Fisher died, and his story, whatever it was about to change everything. Robert Red Dog Laramie had been in custody for 3 days when he finally agreed to talk. The sheriff's deputies brought him black coffee and a cigarette, and for the first time, he seemed almost calm. Sheriff Mason sat across from him, recorder on the table, yellow light flickering overhead. "You said you and Leonard Fisher knew each other," Mason began. "How far back does that go?" Laramie took a slow drag, smoke curling from his lips. "Vietnam," he said. "Same unit, same mud. We were just kids trying to survive. After the war, We both took to the road. Guess neither of us liked standing still anymore. Mason nodded. And you reconnected in '91? Yeah. Ran into him at a way station near Spokane. He was working regular freight. Me, I was doing some side jobs, hauling cargo that didn't always come with paperwork. Stolen goods, Mason said flatly. Laramie smiled faintly. Call it what you want. Fisher wasn't that kind of man, not at first. But money was tight. He told me about the bills, the mortgage, the company cutting pay. Said he couldn't keep up. I made him an offer. Just one job, quick run through Montana. Easy cash. Mason studied him. And he agreed, Laramie nodded. Against his better judgment. He thought he could get away with it once. Told me it'd be the last time. According to Laramie, the cargo wasn't dangerous. Just stolen electronics bound for a buyer in Rapid City. They were supposed to meet at a remote rest stop off the highway, but when the storm rolled in, the deal fell apart. The buyer never showed, and Fisher panicked. He wanted to turn himself in, Laramie said. Said he was done running loads that didn't belong to him. Told me he'd rather face the law than lie to his wife another day. And that's when things went bad? Mason asked. Laramie's jaw tightened. We argued. He said he was going to call the cops. I told him to wait it out until morning, but he wouldn't listen. He got out of the truck, said he was walking to the nearest station for help. Did you follow him? Laramie hesitated. For a while. But the storm swallowed everything. I lost him in the whiteout. Next morning I found his rig empty. I searched until my fuel was gone. I didn't kill him, Sheriff. He froze out there alone. Then why bury him? Mason pressed. Laramie's eyes flickered. Because by the time I found him, he was already gone, and I knew if anyone found that truck full of stolen gear, they'd hang both of us for it. So I buried him, took what I could and disappeared. He crushed the cigarette in the ashtray. That's the truth. Whether you believe it or not, when the interview ended, Mason stepped out into the hallway where Eddie waited. The young man's eyes burned with restrained fury. He's lying, Eddie said. My dad wasn't a criminal. Mason's voice was quiet. Maybe not. But we both know the road doesn't always tell the truth. And somewhere in the gaps of Laramie's story, the sheriff could feel it. Something still didn't add up. Sheriff Mason spent the next week buried in paperwork, piecing together the fragments of Laramie's story. Most of it checked out. Old delivery logs, way station records, and a handful of unregistered cargo manifests that hinted at something larger than one man's desperation. Still, the timeline didn't fit. If Fisher had truly tried to turn himself in, why had no one ever received his call? He asked the FBI for assistance, and soon 2 agents arrived from Helena with access to federal archives. They found a pattern. Over the course of several months in late 1990, Leonard's routes had quietly shifted. His company hadn't assigned those detours. Someone else had. Shortcuts through isolated roads, late-night deliveries that left no trace in payroll records. It painted a troubling picture. Leonard hadn't just stumbled into one illegal job. He'd been running off route for months. Eddie sat across from Mason in the sheriff's office when the findings came in. You're saying my dad was smuggling? His voice cracked between disbelief and anger. I'm saying he might have been helping someone move goods under the table, Mason replied carefully. It doesn't mean he was a criminal. Maybe he didn't even know what was in the cargo. Eddie shook his head. You didn't know him. He wouldn't have lied to us. I believe that, Mason said, which means someone else was pulling the strings. The agents traced the operation back to a small freight yard outside of Missoula, a company registered under a fake name. It folded 3 months after Leonard's disappearance. The owner, when questioned, admitted to knowing Laramie but claimed Leonard was just a driver, not part of the thefts. He was clean, the man said, too clean. That's why Laramie didn't like him. That night, Mason revisited the evidence box, Leonard's wallet, watch, the folded note found in his grave. He stared again at that single word. Sorry. It looked hurried, written in pencil. The handwriting was Leonard's. Eddie came by later, unable to stay away. He studied the note too. He wrote this before he died, he said quietly. He was trying to tell us something. Maybe he regretted what he got caught up in, Mason offered. Eddie looked up, his eyes hard. Or maybe he was apologizing for something else. The next day, Mason interrogated Laramie again. "You said you buried him because you were scared," the sheriff began. "But what were you scared of, the law or the people behind those shipments?" Laramie stared at him for a long moment. "You don't understand, Sheriff. Those weren't just stolen goods. That cargo belonged to men who don't forgive mistakes. Leonard knew that. He was going to expose it, and if he had, a lot of powerful folks would have burned." "So they killed him?" Mason pressed. Laramie's voice dropped to a whisper. "No. He died because he tried to do the right thing. I just made sure no one found him." When Mason left the room, the weight of it hung heavy. The truth wasn't buried under snow anymore. It was buried under loyalty, guilt, and fear, frozen deeper than any Montana winter could reach. For weeks, Sheriff Mason replayed Robert Laramie's confession, trying to separate truth from survival. The man was too calm, too rehearsed, but one thing stood out. He never denied being there when Leonard Fisher died. So Mason turned to the only remaining source of clarity, the original tapes. Back in '91, deputies had recorded the CB transmissions from that night. The old reels had gathered dust for years, but when Mason had them restored, a chilling detail surfaced. Between Leonard's final call and the storm cutting the signal, there was another faint voice, Laramie's, unmistakably. The words were hard to make out, but one phrase pierced through the static. "Don't do this, Len." That single sentence shattered the story Laramie had built. Eddie sat in Mason's office when the tape played for the first time. He leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "That's him, that's Red Dog." Mason nodded. "It proves they were together when your father disappeared. The question is, what happened after that?" The official version said Leonard had walked into the blizzard alone, but now that seemed impossible. Mason pushed for another interrogation. This time he brought the tape recorder into the room. When the line played, Laramie's expression flickered. "Where'd you get that?" "From the night he died," Mason said. "Oh, you told us you found him frozen, but this sounds like an argument." Laramie's hands twitched. "We fought, yeah, he was going to turn the truck in. I told him not to. Said we'd both end up behind bars. He didn't care. He said, 'I'm done lying to Diane and my boy.'" "So you stopped him?" Mason pressed. "I tried to," Laramie said quietly. "But he was stronger than he looked. We slipped near the creek." He hit his head on the rail. Mason's eyes narrowed. "That's the injury the coroner found." Laramie's voice cracked for the first time. "He was still breathing when I left. I swear it. I thought he'd wake up. I panicked, Sheriff. When I came back, he was gone. I thought the cold took him, so I buried him." The room fell silent. Later that night, Mason wrote in his report that Leonard Fisher's death was no longer a question of who killed him, but how fear did. Fear of the law, of shame, of consequences that seemed bigger than life itself. Eddie, however, couldn't find peace in that version. He didn't just die in a fall, he said. He died because someone cared more about saving themselves. Mason didn't argue. Maybe both things are true. Outside the station, the Montana wind carried the sound of passing trucks, an endless hum like ghosts on the highway. For the first time in 10 years, the pieces of that frozen night had names, voices, and motives. Yet something about Laramie's story still felt incomplete. The man spoke of panic, of guilt, but not of regret. And deep down, Mason knew that wasn't the full truth. Somewhere in the storm that night, something else had happened, something Laramie wasn't ready to say, and until he did, Leonard Fisher's ghost would not rest. The trial of Robert Red Dog. Laramie began on a cold November morning in 2002. Snow lined the courthouse steps in Billings, as if winter itself had returned to witness what it had hidden for more than a decade. The courtroom was small, the air heavy with the smell of old wood and tension. Reporters filled the benches, their notebooks open, waiting for a headline that would finally close Montana's most haunting mystery. Eddie Fisher sat behind the prosecution's table, his mother beside him. Diane's hands were folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the man who had taken everything from them. Laramie looked older, diminished. Gone was the defiance he once carried. What remained was a man worn down by years of guilt. The prosecution built their case methodically. The CB recordings, the forged gas receipt, the eyewitness accounts from the diner in Hardin all painted the same picture. Leonard Fisher and Robert Laramie together on the night of the storm, one alive, one soon to vanish. The defense argued there was no proof of murder, only panic and poor judgment, but it was Laramie's own voice that turned the tide. On the third day, he asked to take the stand. The courtroom fell silent as he adjusted the microphone, his voice rough but steady. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said. "Leonard was my friend. We'd seen things in Vietnam that never left us. He was one of the good ones, the kind that believed people could still do the right thing. I wasn't built that way." He paused, glancing toward Diane and Eddie. "That night he told me he was going to confess about the stolen load. I begged him not to, said we'd both go to prison. He called me a coward, and he was right. I grabbed his arm, tried to stop him. He slipped, hit his head hard on the guardrail. When I saw the blood, I froze. I told myself the storm would bury it all, that no one would ever know. But I've lived with it every day since." The courtroom was silent except for the hum of the heater. Diane closed her eyes, tears falling quietly. Eddie's jaw clenched, but beneath the anger there was something else. Exhaustion, maybe even pity. Laramie continued, voice trembling now. "He didn't deserve to die that way. And I didn't deserve to walk free all these years. I'm sorry for what I took from you." When he stepped down, no one spoke. The jury didn't take long. He was convicted of obstruction of justice and unlawful disposal of a body, but not murder. There was no evidence he'd intended Leonard's death. After the verdict, Diane approached him one last time as officers led him away. "You buried him," she said quietly. "Now you'll bury the truth inside you for the rest of your life." Laramie nodded. "I already have." Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and relentless. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like a curse. It felt like closure. After the trial, Billings returned to its quiet rhythm, but for Eddie Fisher, nothing felt the same. The courthouse, the cameras, the endless retelling of his father's death, all of it blurred into noise. When the verdict was read, people said justice had been served, but Eddie didn't feel justice. He felt hollow. Laramie's confession had answered the how, but not the why. It hadn't erased the years his mother spent waiting by the window, or the childhood he'd lost to silence and anger. Closure, he realized, wasn't something the law could deliver. It had to come from the road, the same road that had taken his father away. That winter, Eddie packed his duffel bag, said goodbye to his mother, and climbed into his rig. He'd been driving freight runs for nearly 5 years now, but this one was different. His destination wasn't on any map. He just wanted to follow the old route from Spokane to Billings, the one Leonard Fisher never finished. The first night, snow began to fall, light at first, then heavier as he crossed into Montana. The hum of the tires and the low rumble of the CB radio filled the cab, a rhythm that felt almost familiar. He thought about his father, about the man who taught him to change oil before he could ride a bike, who could fix anything but the distance that always stretched between them. By dawn, he reached Pryor Creek, the stretch of highway where Leonard had disappeared. Eddie parked on the shoulder and stepped out into the cold. The landscape hadn't changed much, still quiet, still endless, the air sharp with the scent of frost. He walked toward the ditch where the truck had been found all those years ago. In his pocket, he carried a small tin box. Inside were Leonard's dog tags, the watch recovered from the grave, and the note with the single word, "Sorry." He knelt, set the box down by a marker someone had placed years earlier, and whispered, "You made it home, Dad. Took you a while, but you made it." The wind moved across the open fields, gentle and low, almost like a voice answering. Later that week, Eddie stopped by the nursing home in Red Lodge, where Sheriff Tom Harkins lived now. The old man's hair was thin, his voice weaker, but his eyes still sharp. "Didn't think I'd see you again, kid," Harkins said. "I had to thank you," Eddie replied. "You were the only one who didn't give up." Harkins smiled faintly. "You kept driving when the rest of us parked it. Your old man would have been proud." For the first time, Eddie believed him. When he left, the highway stretched out ahead, bathed in the pale gold of a winter sunset. For years, the road had been a place of loss. Now it felt like something else, a way forward. As he climbed back into his truck, Eddie looked once more at the horizon and thought of his father. Not as the man who vanished, but as the one who taught him that even the longest road can still lead home. The morning broke pale and cold over the Montana plains, the kind of winter light that carried both peace and sorrow. Eddie Fisher sat behind the wheel of his truck, parked near Pryor Creek, the same stretch of highway where his father's story had ended. For a long time he didn't move. He just listened to the hum of the engine and the low whistle of the wind across the empty fields. He'd made this drive dozens of times, but this time it felt different. It wasn't about freight, deadlines, or the road ahead. It was about closing a circle that had taken 14 long years to complete. The mystery was over, the questions answered, and yet the ache remained. A quiet echo of everything the snow had taken and everything it had returned. He stepped out of the cab, boots crunching against the frozen gravel. The wind cut sharp against his face, but he didn't flinch. He walked toward the small roadside marker that bore his father's name, the one the community had placed there after the trial. Someone, maybe a stranger, had left a small cross made of wire and wood. Eddie pulled Leonard's dog tags from his pocket, the metal worn smooth from years of handling. He hung them gently from the cross, the chain catching a sliver of sunlight. "You can rest now," he said quietly. "It's over." The highway stretched in both directions, endless and silent. Somewhere far off, the faint sound of a passing truck rolled through the air, a lonely reminder that the road never really stopped for anyone. Back in Billings, Diane had started working part-time again at the local clinic. The years had softened her grief into something steadier, something that didn't hurt as sharply anymore. When Eddie called her that afternoon, she could hear the peace in his voice for the first time. "I went out to the marker," he told her. "And?" "I think he's finally home," Eddie said. She was quiet for a moment, then whispered, "So are you." That night, Eddie pulled his rig onto the open road again, driving east with no particular destination. The sky was wide and clear, the stars sharp above the black line of the highway. He flipped on the CB radio, listening to the familiar static that had once haunted his childhood. "Breaker 19, a voice said through the fuzz. "Anybody rolling eastbound on the 90? Eddie smiled faintly and pressed the mic. "Copy that. This is Fisher. I'm eastbound." The reply came warm and steady. "Keep it safe out there, Fisher. Long road ahead." "Always is," he answered. He let the radio go quiet and glanced at the photograph taped to his dashboard, the same one that had once ridden with Leonard through every storm. Diane smiling, a boy grinning beside her. A family frozen in time but no longer lost to it. The snow began to fall again, slow and gentle, dusting the road like ash. But this time it didn't feel cruel. It felt like forgiveness. And as the highway stretched out beneath him, Eddie Fisher drove on, not to escape the past, but to carry it forward, one last mile at a time.